I'm Chris Levesque. I live in Seattle, but it's actually great to be here in New England because this is where my roots are. I actually grew up in southern New Hampshire, about an hour from here, and went to grad school at MIT. And earlier in my career, I worked at 2 different submarine bases in New England. And as I was thinking about this talk on advanced nuclear energy today, I was reflecting on when my nuclear story began. And you might think that was at MIT or in my Navy nuclear training. But actually, that story began in a 1970s living room, watching the news with my parents. Because at that time, we were a one-device family. It was a big box called a Zenith Color TV, and that's what we all watched, and kids ended up watching the news with their parents. And there was a story on the news during my entire adolescence that was just over and over repeated in the news. And that was the story of the construction and the opposition to the Seabrook nuclear power plant, just 1 hour north of here. It started construction in 1976, and it didn't reach full power until almost 1990. When I would watch these images as a kid, and then as a teenager, and then in college, I would wonder what's driving all of this opposition. For sure, the communication from the project developers could have been better. Not everybody understands nuclear energy, right? So I'm sure we could have done better with that. But also it turns out that nuclear energy has been politicized over the years, and this continues today. Just this year, Fareed Zakaria on CNN reported that the anti-nuclear movement in Germany was funded by the Russian government to try and get the Germans more dependent on Russian natural gas. Nuclear energy has also been dramatized, and we can all remember the China syndrome. Like I said, we can do better on talking to the public, but if we're going to utilize this great source of energy, we need more alignment. I have to tell you, when I was growing up, I can also remember hearing lectures from my middle school teacher in public school in Nashua, New Hampshire, and even my high school teacher updating us on this project. And I never remember hearing fear from these science teachers. I remember hearing kind of a sense of amazement and anticipation. It's not going to surprise you that I've spent my career in nuclear energy, and that career began as a submarine officer in the US Navy. Nuclear submarines are amazing. They've been around for decades. On one nuclear core, a submarine can travel the world for decades. And at the end of the day, your spent nuclear core fits in one shielded container about the size of this stage. When I served on nuclear submarines, I never had a safety concern with nuclear energy. In fact, I thought of nuclear energy as something that was life-sustaining. We used it to make our electricity, to make fresh water, to make air in this closed tube. And at the end of our mission, we relied on nuclear energy to drive us back to the surface and home. Nuclear energy in the Navy has a great safety record. Decades of hundreds of reactors performing with no accidents. One other really interesting thing about nuclear energy, and this is personal for me, when I first qualified to operate a nuclear submarine in a supervisory role, I was 22 years old as a young submarine officer, and I was supervising 19-year-old sailors. So that says something as well. Oh, and back to the Seabrook nuclear power station. In 1989, a judge actually had to decide to overcome the protests and allow the power ascension to full power at Seabrook after many years. You can imagine all the cost impacts from those delays. And since then, the Seabrook nuclear power station has been providing power to 1 million homes for 30 years, totally safely. It's about 20% of our electricity in Massachusetts. And during that period, some who previously opposed nuclear energy now support it. Big example I'll give is John Kerry, our former senator from Massachusetts, and now the President's Special Envoy for Climate Change. In his new role, Senator Kerry has to balance these issues of mitigating climate change and also ensuring energy security. And even though he opposed that judge's decision in 1989, he is now vehemently in support of nuclear energy. In fact, support among Americans is very strong. This Gallup poll from this year shows that 55% of Americans support nuclear energy. So why aren't we building more plants? Some of it goes back to these same phobias with the word nuclear. Some of it is risk aversion. Some of it is overregulation. Also, there's been a total lack of innovation in nuclear energy that has only recently been turned around. Because of some of that risk aversion, we weren't innovating in nuclear science. Can you think of any other field of science where we said we're uncomfortable with that word? Let's put that science in the corner and not promote it anymore. Well, recently, a lot of innovators have realized we're going to need to rely on nuclear. And so innovation in nuclear science has grown, and there's multiple startups now pursuing advanced nuclear technology. Some of them started up right here in Cambridge. In 2014, after a partial career in nuclear energy, working in the Navy and then for some of the more old-fashioned nuclear plants, I received a call from TerraPower. There was a recruiter there who wanted to talk to me about a position. After meeting with a few people there and making it through a few different interview gates, I found myself meeting with Bill Gates, who was the founder of TerraPower. He and our other founders back in 2008 realized this need for innovation. The world's challenges in climate, energy, and even human health are going to require us to leverage nuclear science. They were really visionary. So what's going on in the grid? First, let me say that the electricity grid in the United States and in other developed economies is really a miracle that we take for granted. We change our demand on the grid all throughout the day in our homes and in industry, and we take it for granted that the electricity will be there. And over the last 30 years, I'd say things were pretty static on the grid because we had pretty flat demand growth, because we've moved from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. But let me tell you, we're going to stress the heck out of our electricity grid in the next 30 years, between now and 2050, because there's a lot going on. We're going to double electricity demand due to the electrification of transportation and the industrial sector. We're going to retire 25% of our coal plants by 2029, and we're going to add a massive amount of wind and solar, which is great, but we have to remember that wind and solar are intermittent, and they can change throughout the day. And that situation is complicated by turning off the coal, which is also necessary. But when we do that, we need to realize we're losing that 24/7 baseload power we were relying on with coal. So that means we're going to need even more nuclear. And multiple studies, some even from Cambridge, suggest that the optimum carbon-free grid will include 20 to 30% nuclear. And we do that, we reach those conclusions, like 20 to 30%, when we think at systems level. And that's something I really appreciated in my education at MIT, was the ability to think at systems level. I can't tell you how many lectures started with the professor saying, let's draw a control volume around this problem. I heard maybe just a couple laughs because people recognize that. That helps us take a really complex situation and bring focus to it. And the conclusion inevitably is that we need to move from breaking hydrocarbon molecules to breaking atoms to provide that baseload power. One other thing I want to say about nuclear energy, it's very, very dense. One fuel pellet from even today's reactors, the size of the tip of my pinky, can provide tremendous amounts of energy. It's millions of times more dense than coal or oil or any fossil fuel. The other form of density that nuclear energy gives you is it, per gigawatt, uses much less steel, concrete, and land. The power plant we're building in Wyoming, in fact, that will power 400,000 homes, will only occupy 60 acres, and a solar farm of the same size would take thousands of acres. Well, as I mentioned, our founders at TerraPower started in 2008. They were really futurists, and they recognized these needs for clean energy. They even foretold some of the issues with energy security that we're now seeing. And they put us on a trajectory to develop the natrium reactor that we'll soon break ground on in the state of Wyoming. Natrium will power 400,000 homes, and it will be demonstrated this decade with a massive ramp up in the deployment around the world in the 2030s. We had a really recent innovation with Natrium just 4 years ago, where we added energy storage to the Natrium reactor. And what that did is it took our already very safe reactor that should be much cheaper than today's plants, and it added built-in energy storage. And what that will do is it will optimize that reactor for operating on the grid in parallel with wind and solar, which come and go throughout the day. I'll close by sharing this quote from my boss, Bill Gates, who's said numerous times that solving climate change is the hardest thing mankind has ever attempted. Why does he say that? Some of it's about the technology, but the biggest challenge isn't technology. We're ready for that. If we think through that Seabrook lesson, we see that to do big things like this, transformational things, we need alignment between industry, who's developing these projects, government and public-private partnership, regulators, consumers and the public, consumers of energy, and even academia. I'm not only the CEO of TerraPower, I'm also a father and a grandfather, and I'm concerned about the future. We're dealing with rising CO2. We're going to add another billion people to the world's population in the next century, while we bring an additional billion people out of energy poverty. And we're also dealing with some serious energy security issues that are only now emerging, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine really brought that to light. It's time for us to leverage advanced nuclear energy. This is how we'll show the world and future generations that we're serious about addressing these problems. Thank you.